Okay, so we start now the third edition of European Lab Brussels. So we are online, streaming on Facebook and YouTube. So welcome everyone online and here. Thank you for being here. So this third edition is still in echoes to Nuit Sonore Festival, which is starting tonight as well until Sunday, taking place at BOZAR, but as well in Canal in Brussels. European Lab will be on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, tackling different issues. So we'll start with Joachim de Klerk to deal with a topic around architecture that Joachim will present. And we will then continue with some new MEP representing a new generation of politicians. And we will welcome after that a French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. And we will finish with a climate activist from different collectives in Europe and especially more in Belgium. And tomorrow we will address other issues with clubbing resistance with Bogomir de Ringer, and as well a panel curated by Africa Desk called African Art as Philosophy. And we will finish on Saturday dealing with topics such as temporary use spaces in Brussels and as well the presence of forensic architecture and Sea-Watch. So I let Joachim start this third edition of European Lab. And I hope you will enjoy the 3 days of conferences as well workshops and screenings. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Good. Funny to talk to cameras and 3 people. Thanks for coming. Curious to know if you're from an architecture background or from another background? Architecture? Geography. Okay, spatial backgrounds. As an architect, educated as an architect, together with my partners, we immediately launched ourselves not in building the things for which questions are clear, so houses, opera buildings, or other things, but we try to use the force of imagination and of architecture to envision or to tackle the most complex, wicked problems that we face. The organization I lead together with my colleagues is called Architecture Workroom Brussels. Brussels has many meanings in that name, but the central word is workroom, and the idea is in fact that design can be used not only to answer to given questions that others are formulating, but design can also be used to put things on the agenda, launch new trajectories, but also establish a workspace where in fact we can combine all the demands, ambitions, requirements from very different actors in one process of developing new visions. I'm going to talk about that, especially through the trajectory we set up in a temporary building or occupied building, which is the World Trade Center, in Brussels, which is the WTC is an emblematic building in Brussels. It's an emblematic name worldwide, the World Trade Center. But it's also an emblematic place in Brussels because it was built in place, let's say, by demolishing an entire neighborhood as let's say, a vision of what the future would be in the 1970s. World trade would really bring Belgium, Brussels, and even this central part of Europe to another level economically in terms of progress. And it's of course interesting that exactly that type of iconic, symbolic building gets empty and is also the location where many different challenges in terms of urban development coincide. It's a neighborhood which is linked to car mobility and especially traffic jams rather than mobility. It's a neighborhood that is also the place where many migration, where a lot of the migration coming to this part of Europe lands. So it's a place of many contradictions, so very emblematic to address all of these contradictions. We transformed, or we occupied this building and transformed it into an exhibition, but also much more, and that's actually what I'm going to try to talk to you about. And in that sense, I'm not talking about architecture in the strict sense, but about the role of the designer, the architect, as something that goes beyond responding with design work on given questions, but actually launching and initiating new transformations in cities throughout this part of Europe. We were situated with this building in the northern district of Brussels. That's a kind of central business district in international terms in the city. We were working not only on this city or neighborhood, but on the neighborhood, on the metropolitan area around Brussels, on pieces of Flanders, and also on the delta of the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt. The delta, which is in fact the part of Northwest Europe where actually the economic entity is a river delta. We have countries, but in fact, if you look at the economy and also if you look at the hydrology of this region, these country borders have no importance whatsoever. It's actually one physical urban system with very little rivers, little cities, not one big London city or one big Madrid city, little cities that together form one whole. In that space of that city, neighborhood, metropolitan area, and that delta, we actually thought it would be crucial to address through the lens of architecture and design, and by deploying the capacity of imagination and of binding people around one imaginary of architecture, of design work, to bind people and to address the missing link. And that's actually a very important scheme for us. What we see, that's an attempt to draw a portrait of our times. We have a lot of very ambitious goals. If you look to the top right, the Sustainable Development Goals are the, let's say, the highest end and the broadest type of goals we have set. But we have climate agreements that have a deadline, a point on the horizon in 2030. Also global, but Europe sets a lot of goals on water quality and so on. But also until very little municipalities everywhere sign a covenant of mayors, for example, or formulate a goal in terms of sustainability. And that's actually something, the top right of this diagram, where we have to go to. That's actually the points on the horizon. Is a very crucial type of action. A lot of negotiation is happening in many fields to draw these points, to agree on these points. That's one. Second, left bottom, we have an incredible multiplication of initiatives and of experiments, of living labs, and even the words to describe what this all is are multiplying. And so we see a lot of initiatives. That's the second element. We see a lot of investment, a lot of government action to launch new experimental projects to make the transition happen. But if we then try to be a little bit critical, we see that the many initiatives do not add up, literally, to bring us to the ambitious goals top right. We are in a way stuck. There's a glass ceiling which makes that the little initiatives, the many local initiatives, do not add up to the bigger change. But also for people that are in government responsible for realizing the ambitious goals at the top right, they have a glass ceiling. They literally do not know how to land in specific places, communities, and so on. We describe that as the missing link, as something that is really describing this, a very crucial description of our times. And with this missing link, we actually try to say the most important thing we need to address is how we actually can accelerate or multiply the changes in our society so that we could eventually maybe not formulate goals, but also design pathways to reach those goals. And then comes back the question of space, because the moment you talk about these many goals to the top right, not everything, but a large part of all of these goals, transitions, energy, food, water, solidarity, are always things that you can describe in abstract numbers, mathematics, texts and goals. But finally, they have to land in one space. And you could even say that there's a battle for space. There's an ongoing battle for space. And this battle for space is, for example, in every street of any city in Europe, you have the roads, the current mobility system that requires a lot of space to pass by with cars, to stock cars, so the kind of cemetery for cars which cities have become. But at the same time, in cities we need much more water infiltration. It's the same space. We cannot make cities resilient in terms of peak rain and drought periods if we cannot change our mobility system. So the moment you look at all of these ambitious goals that are far away from us in time, and you bring them to concrete spaces, you can actually start to see the connections, the interdependencies between those problems, and you can actually start designing on these questions. And that's actually for which we set up an environment. What you see is that design can bring in several things. One is to change the rhetoric. The future is described as something that engenders a lot of loss, less flying, less meat and continue, less income, less wealth. But in fact, the future, if we can start imagining the future, it has always worked like that in the past. We can also try to describe and talk about the future as something that also is about a lot of wins, a lot of qualities we could win. That's one side of the imagination. A lot of exercises are already ongoing at neighborhood levels, at regional levels at this scale, but still the major narrative in cities throughout Europe, but actually throughout the world, is a narrative of loss. The future will be less, hence we actually stay where we are. We do not change. It's better not to change because we will lose. Imagination can actually help clarify what we could win, which kind of environment we could wish for and decide to move towards. The second thing is we need to bring all these major questions to the here and the now. They are not far away from us. 2030 is actually now, but they're also here. They are not very abstract. They are not paragraphs in policy documents. They are changes in your street. And to make it here and now is very easy if you make a historical description. These are a fantastic exercise that has been done by the Flemish Architecture Institute with universities and photographers, which is to build on the historical photography, the two top photographs, same location photographed in two instances in history. In 2004 and 2014, if I'm not mistaken, the same location was photographed again. And then you see that you can describe how a water system top left, which had the capacity to store a lot of water and to deal with the variations in our climate, has become one of the most hardened, let's say, sealed, capped surfaces of Europe. So this part of the delta has as much hard surface as Malta, which is a rock. So it means that, and we are the top of Europe, no other place in Europe has so much of its total surface that is hardened, concrete, so impermeable for water. And you can actually see that. The question is now, how can we, in a way, go back in time, not in time, but go back in that logic and make space again for this infiltration. And we can only do that when we do that here and now. And that's also something that people are interested in. If we use an example of something we collaborated on in Kortrijk, a little city in the west of Belgium, the moment you start to say to citizens, you have to choose, are you in favor of cycling? Everybody will say yes. Are you in favor of green? Yes. Are you in favor of double parking, two sides parking? Yes, preferably. Are you instead in favor of one direction or two directions in your street? Preferably two. The moment you say, sorry, the planet has a space that is limited, but also your street has a space that is limited, so you will have to help us choose. That's the moment when citizens become much more smart, intelligent, try to understand why, what would be important, and help, bottom right, to decide for what they would like to make space. And it's not something that people withdraw from, it's something they engage with, because it's the moment they can actually make it very concrete. If we have less space for cars, we have more space for infiltration, green, for safe, slow mobility. And it's actually a cycle. Everything depends on each other in the limited space we have. And it's something people can really engage with. So the big question is, how can we break down these enormous challenges that are ahead of us and that we talk about on a daily rhythm in the newspapers to concrete transformations, feasible, something we can see, touch, talk about in the concrete spaces of our environment. But then if we do that, there are many examples of this, but then the question is, how can we accelerate or multiply? The question is not to do that once, because then we're in the left bottom again. One good initiative does not change the world. It's an enormous effort to realize it, but still the hope is that we can find moments of acceleration. And that's something that is also interesting, because there you see new networks establishing, governmental networks, but also sometimes citizens' initiatives. The protests around schools in Belgium, which were provoked by a documentary on television showing that in the blood and urine of kids, the amount of damaging particles produced by traffic is so high, led to protests at every school gate, 130 schools every Friday morning. And that actually leads to a network. If we could actually try to work with this network and make sure that around these 130 places we can change the streetscape, we will change also the behavior of those parents bringing their kids to school, and we will actually have maybe much more impact than making making mobility plans for a distant future. So the goal is, can we accelerate? And the same goes for the drought problem. We are working with farmers and all the policymakers in terms of farming to deal with the drought problem, not by making a drought plan or a strategy that is maps and very ambitious goals, but it is about facilitating changes by these farmers, making space for water management on their plots, something that they're very much against. So we need to find ways to break it up and to multiply this entire change. And that's also what we try to do, to make a place for, which is not this institutional space of BOZAR or of other cultural institutions, but which is an in-between space, a cultural in-between space, where it's not belonging to either the cultural sector, either the governmental sector, either the profit-driven sector or the non-profit-driven sector. It's an in-between space, a free space to share and couple the capacities of citizens' initiatives with governmental capacities, sometimes finances, but also knowledge, academic institutions, cultural capacities, and so on. The occupation of this World Trade Center, of which you see a photograph here, into a manifestation, you could say, with the title "You Are Here." You are here, meaning to invite you to the place where this was happening, but to also confront you with the fact that we are completely stuck here. We need to move to another place if you look at this missing link diagram, but we're completely stuck where we are. That's where we started to occupy the building, to see the building as a stage, to see the building as a test site, and to see the building as an exhibition. And a stage for working sessions, an occupation, a walk, a promenade architecturale for the architects, a very famous term coined by Le Corbusier for his villa projects, became a kind of walk through a building, through exhibitions, to end up with a working space, a building that has actually an enormous quality, you could say, which is no longer visible because no longer there, will be renovated and become another type of building. And a building where we actually try to say we can hack that missing link if we can make an in-between space between all these very different actors, which will be necessary to implement change. We're talking about farmers, developers, designers, the building practice, even the material providers. If we want to go to a circular economy, we can talk about policy making for that. But actually, it's more in the pragmatics of doing that we have to invent. The cultural innovation is really the change of culture, for which you need cultural innovation, is much more in the doing than in the talking about what we should do. We've talked for a long time about what we should do. So what was set up is actually a threefold structure. It was an exhibition. An exhibition, you could describe it best as a library of good practices. Not the ones that we did, but the ones that others are doing in many different places. We try to structure that so that we could actually build a narrative. The second thing is an urban debate program. And the third thing is a shared societal workspace. A workspace where we offered coffee, apples, water, support by designers for trajectories that could be set up by governments or by local initiatives, citizens' initiatives. We assisted them to connect to each other, to bridge actually from a local initiative that is sometimes mostly actually starting from protest to go from protest to proposition, and from proposition to see who could actually be the governmental institution or the financing private party to go with this project. So if you make it more simple, it's a podium, an exhibition, it's a forum, a debate place, and it's a learning by doing or an incubator for new strategies on the other hand. The forum was actually bringing together very different initiatives in this one place from different scales, so from this same delta, but also from very different horizons. The forum was composed of a series of public debates where we immediately combined governmental responsibles, not with their peers, because that's the ones they meet on a daily basis, but with others. So with people from the design world that actually produce ideas that can only be valued, truly valued, if they are not remaining in the field of architecture and architecture publications, but move into the field of conversation with these other policymakers or economic actors. So a mixing space. That became around 10 societal challenges for which we had as criterion. They have to be and structurally important, but also be part of the daily debate in newspapers. We said we organize part of the exhibition, but also part of the debate sessions. And for example, food growers make city, mobility as an urban project, urban by nature, circular city harbors, they're all touching on transitions, but also on types of places where we can make that happen. The same goes for working sessions, where we try to actually think of how we can actually organize this, not in this place only, but how we can actually learn from many different places where these in-between societal incubators, there are different words, impact hubs, you have all kinds of words of new types of places. You could say it's the infrastructure of our cities of the future, for the future and of the future. It's not only the standard known cultural buildings we have. It's not the theaters only. It's not the schools. It's also these workspaces which are not defined in terms of producing or offering something that you can consume as culture. It's a space where you can actually produce something new, co-produce something new. It requires a specific societal workspace, learning network, also financial models are being discussed, co-financing, cooperative models, alternative democratic systems are used there, because it's no longer about the one that is in governmental level decides. It's actually the real decision is a coalition of people from government with people on the ground and others. That's what can make change happen. That's what we organized. And a third level we organized is also an exchange between the practice. We called it the practice of practices, different design disciplines doing very different types of work, the ones being busy with public buildings, up till the others exploring what the circular economy would mean for urban development, up till others being busy to develop their own new circular building materials, very different types of things, each of those very fragile, like very little extremely ambitious but very fragile operation, economically fragile, but also content-wise fragile. But then if you see what the design capacity is, if you add it up and you make a chain effect, the one mapping how circular metabolic flows in cities could actually be crucial for the further urban development, with the ones producing new types of material, with the ones like rotor deconstruction, harvesting materials in our city, that actually can become a chain effect, which is of structural importance. So a practice of practices is a crucial approach to say individually each practice can be genius. That's what architects also mostly love, to be the individual genius. But actually it's in the shared capacity we can identify, and in the chain effects of those capacities that real change can start to happen. You see how this also became a space where very different types of publics, the tours we did, the material that is around the table always changed and evolved, because we made a library of good examples to address different subjects. It also became a space where the youngest in our society were having classes in their classrooms at school, but then came with their visions for the future to this place to discuss around a pilot cities site what the future could be. So it's something that is very difficult to imagine, but the moment I would say that it's much more simple for kids than for people that are professionally educated, that's actually rather the truth. Kids understand that if it rains, that the rain has to go in the soil, while we who know that a city is hardened for cars have immediately a reaction that says, but then we have to change the mobility system, and we see complexity, so we say stop, reduce the solution to the things we can handle. Don't touch the complexity. Kids go through complexities. And that's actually an interesting side of doing. But of course, all of this is an environment in which the crucial aspect is the learning by doing. So the learning by doing requires an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure of tables, of people meeting. It's an infrastructure in the sense that a methodology was offered. Bring in a tangible urgency around the table. We will help you connect with others which have the same type of question. Together we will try to envision what a strategic approach is for these different locations, school environments, for example, or farmers with drought problems. We will help you identify a common strategy, and if we can identify this common strategy, we can actually also connect to the policymakers, financing parties that are ready for that, and we can, point 5, trigger, that was the word we invented, viral transformation. A virus is mostly something quite negative, but the logic of a virus, which is that it invades many places at the same time, it goes into the veins of a system, that's actually the change we need, and that's the way to hack the missing link. Some images. It functioned as an incubator, where here we see, for example, the designers, air quality experts, urbanists, mobility experts with parents from schools. From 15 schools we selected to work on a Saturday morning on the changes of their direct school environment, working around the table with the plans on the table we prepared so that they could not talk about something but prospect what would be the changes in their direct environment. Same session, but it also goes for here the farmers, showing how their concrete problems on the ground are actually the same as the ones that are described in ambitious visionary strategy documents at governmental levels or academic studies on the same questions. We need to bind this knowledge together in certain places, and that's actually for which this space provided an infrastructure and the support. The effect of this is, and that's where it became surprising for the ones organizing amongst others, and in the we No. Is it okay if I take this microphone, the other one? Yes? Online has sound? Thanks. To our surprise, this became an incubator where governments threw in trajectories, questions, where local citizen groups threw in questions into the space, met each other, and out of this, with a lot of hard work, of course, not as a lottery system, it became something in which new trajectories were incubated. It took 3-4 months to start from something. We're still busy with working on things that started in September 2018 and that we're accompanying to become something else. But the fact that, for example, these people were working together led to different trajectories, but that's also investment trajectories, where suddenly as a trajectory was being prepared by the Department of Planning, the space was hosting a forum on deconcreting, decapping, so taking away the hard surface in our urban environments. 60 to 70 people said, we are ready to come, which suddenly means, oh, we're not talking about a policy idea, we're talking about concrete questions in different places and cities. Suddenly you have a constituency, you have a mini democracy around the vague ambition. And that mini democracy is crucial, because the moment you can share questions and share beliefs that you need to change, you can also go to politicians, not as experts saying, if we analyze the climate change, we can advise you that you should actually take away the hard surface in your cities. That's an interesting advice from experts to policymakers. But the moment you can build a constituency for that change, a demand-driven change, you have a constituency that has another voice and another effect on political and policy-making systems. And that means that you build up an environment in which suddenly a minister understands that the advice she already got from her policy-making administrations is more than an advice. It reflects the concrete questions on the ground for support from supra-local governments. Leads to, we will make free 10 million euros for 50 pilot projects in Dhardening, supporting local actors to make it happen on the ground. So it's the reversal of the logic. The supra-local authority does not do it on the ground, but says, I will support many different actions in different fields on the ground. The same goes for the drought or water approach, the dehardening, the drought problems, the development of agricultural parks or agricultural landscapes around cities is now being developed, because from the strong unions busy with agriculture and from the cities, there are different demands, but they come together in demanding that the fringes of our cities would not be occupied with housing so that we generate even more mobility, but that there the open space would be protected, also for food production for the city, because many cities are developing food strategies for which you need space. So the battle for space I started with becomes very clear, and here agricultural parks are being developed. Slow mobility neighborhoods was a trajectory that was developed. In Brussels, you have the good move. You also have the good food strategy, but also the good move strategy, which is a strategic plan to actually make sure that neighborhoods are low intensive in terms of going through, drive through better traffic. But that also requires a strategy to implement that as a policy idea. That's one. But to implement it, the implementation requires really another process and another invention. I will skip some of those. The podium allowed us to actually bring people to these ideas and also to this place, which is not about, and other people brought other people, so it was a kind of a cascading effect, where it's not about the ones you know that you bring around the table. It's the ones you do not know yet. It's people that are busy with something of which you have no knowledge whatsoever in your own network, that are invited, that get the kind of space, infrastructure, support to come and make the next step. And therefore the exhibition, the occupation of the World Trade Center, and what is at the heart of a World Trade Center is clearly a bank, of course. The old bank lobby became a place where we exhibited very different voices on climate change, where we actually, the statement was, we have to go beyond words. And with the words of many interesting people, we tried to highlight that. A second exhibition, The Practice of Practices, which was, or The Future is a Practice, an exhibition where we exhibited 24 very, very different types of practices, which add up to which together actually enable us to think that we could make really drastic change. And the top, let's say the 23rd floor, which is not the top, but the higher floor of the building, became the kind of library of strategies around very different strategies. This is the strategy City as Sponge, where in fact we need to make water infiltration in our cities feasible. That water infiltration is something for which you need strategies at the global scale. The World Bank has policies on that. There's lots of money for that, but they don't find projects on the ground. And we're working on the Water as Leverage project as one of those. You have urban projects you need. You have the vertical element is a creek in Genk, a city in Flanders, where in fact through one valley system the attempt is to really reform the entire city through the lens of water, of making sponge capacity in a city. But also in Brussels, the right, you see the typical Brussels houses, where in fact one of the crucial questions is how will we deal in Brussels with all the water that falls on this very hard concrete city, which flows into the gutter, the sewage system, and then into the canal and the Seine River. But if we have that, it means that it goes into the sewage system, and all the dirt goes also in our river systems, the canal and the Seine River, once a week on average. So it means we need completely different system to stock and let the water that falls on our city infiltrate. And it means that you can actually start with your garden. The way you deal with water on your roof going to your garden is a crucial element to deal with this global challenge of dealing with the water problem. And that's the interesting thing we always try to highlight, that you all know the Matrushka dolls, the Russian dolls. If you take one off the other, you always end up with a smaller one. That's how we have to think of change. That's also how we have to design change. We need to work, and that's what architects, urbanists were specialists, big problems, and politicians also. Big problems need big decisions. Big problems, big visionary moments at regional scales or national scales. But in fact, if we can't break it up to small interventions from our house, our building block, our street, our neighborhood, to the city, if we can't build it up from there, it is intangible first, and second, it can never happen. It's in our neighborhoods that we need to realize it. Also in the neighborhood, here Pool is Cool as a fantastic organization with a strong plea for open-air swimming pools in Brussels with lots of success, given that the new regional political agreement includes going for implementation of these schools, occupied the fountain in the midst of this car mobility-driven central business district of Brussels, the Manhattan district as it's called, which also shows the initial ambition of the 70s for this. Next is that we're trying to continue this construction for the next years, and actually this pooling of knowledge, the initiation of trajectories and the realization of these things. So from pooling through an exhibition, everything that is being developed, organizing a platform where different actors can come together to make the next steps, to formulate what the next steps could be, and to incubate next steps towards realization. That's actually how we are building our future steps. We are already, that's a drawing of where we are moving to. We now occupy another temporary occupation, the Actiris building at the Bourse in Brussels, which is a former government building which will become a private development, but in the meantime it's empty. There was, just like in the World Trade Center, there was occupation by artists, which are always the first to find and occupy these places. And like in the WTC, we in a way followed them. Many of the same people which were in the WTC World Trade Center are now in the Actiris building, and we occupied the first floor of that building, where we will again try to host a workspace. We launched it today. There were all the Dhardening, the 25 of the Dhardening projects work together in this place, exchanging their ideas, their capacities, their insights, so that we can actually pool and add up the knowledge we have instead of work plick-plock in different locations without concertation, without adding up and building the next step. One of our structural ambitions, and it stays at the level of ambition because of financial capacities, is the exhibition is a very heavy format to group knowledge. Our hope is, but it's also a very heavy format, that we can actually build a growing online library of strategies to make that happen, so that it becomes much more of a peer-to-peer environment, an environment in which the peers, there's many municipalities that are now working on the energy transition in neighborhoods. They're all having the same problem. What happens now is that each of those commissions to the same type of consultancy offices and designers, let's say, commissions the same type of question. It's a ridiculous system. If we can't pool the questions we have, we can never have a structural impact with the answers we develop. So we need a more online, networked, peer-to-peer platform and environment to facilitate structural change and to actually have a critical mass of change. That knowledge is in development. I could stop here. One thing I would like to, I have 3, 4, 5 more minutes, which is something that came out of this, is the development of an atelier, a platform. The first attempt of this peer-to-peer environment started, or we initiated it together with Dutch and Belgian parties on the Delta. We are broadening it now to Germany and parts of France, which is the Delta Atelier. The Delta Atelier is, of course, focusing on this physical system which we started to inhabit ages ago, centuries ago, but in the 12th century, we talk now about the urban age, but this was the first place in the world that urbanized very quickly, where we had suddenly an economic upward cycle, but also an urbanization. That's the moment when many of the cities we now know knew a first important growth. That's also an environment where you can clearly see in the historical maps that the importance of the water system, of the soil quality, was linked to where cities were located, because that was our first transport, it was the first metro network, but then water driven. And so you see that the link between us having built an enormous urban system on top of this very, let's say, fertile soil, water intensive and water rich environment was crucial. The missing link I already explained. The agreement on this cooperation is strong, so between different parties at the Benelux level, Flemish, Dutch, North Rhine-Westphalen, Flanders, North Rhine-Westphalen, everybody with each other has agreements that it's very important, but there's actually no shared development of questions or strategies. Actually, everybody's negotiating with one another. If the Netherlands wants to build something through Flanders, they are negotiating. We want to do this and we want you to allow us to do this. If Belgium wants that the port of Antwerp can actually reach the North Sea and hence the oceans and other ports, they're negotiating. But there's no shared narrative. And so one of the things we were involved in between 2015 and 18 was the first exploration of a lowland or a delta strategy, a shared strategy for this environment. Where in fact I will go through several strategies for how can we change our spatial layout or organization of our cities and our landscapes in function of a shared ambition in terms of renewable energy. The Netherlands were then still very gas addicted, with Shell as the global corporation coming from the Netherlands were still gas addicted. They had 3 to 4% of renewable energy sources, which was one of the lowest in Europe. Now, as Groningen is trembling as a consequence of fracking, they're accelerating in incredible speeds as the Dutch are able to do their transition towards renewable energy and going off the gas system. But that is a real challenge of how you do that together. We can't do it alone. You cannot think of it alone. The same goes for mobility and for agriculture. Together, the Netherlands and Belgium are the largest exporter in terms of food products, agro-industry of the world, before the United States. So if you look at the delta as a unit, it's the largest port of the world, it's the largest exporter of agro-industrial products. So if you want to change, if you want to move towards a carbon neutral environment, you can imagine that the ports will not, one of the ports will not say, imagine Antwerp, I will go fast, I will go towards a circular economy. Rotterdam would actually be much more popular because they continue with the fossil fuel driven economy. So you need an agreement on how you move towards the future. Otherwise you compete each other downward instead of forward, or backward instead of forward. So what we did is also trying to bridge knowledge. And in 2018 we actually launched a call for initiatives in this delta that want to form a peer-to-peer environment, a delta atelier, to say we have knowledge at the national level, we have knowledge in little cities on the transitions, energy, food, and so on. And we brought together more than 50 people. We exhibited, we made narratives of what they are able to do together. Somebody's in a small location intervening in energy renovation with somebody else intervening in energy landscapes and a national energy policy, the Russian doll. That's actually how you can actually build a narrative of how change could really happen. And it's always change that is spatialized. It's not intangible changes of behavior. It's really changing or adapting our environment so that we can live a different life. We built an exhibition around that in Rotterdam with all these examples from small to bigger. And in this exhibition, we actually started to collect all the insights, make a workbook, a strategy book, you could say, connect experts to that, and hold sessions, add up the knowledge and formulate together what the next steps would be. And because these next steps were not formulated by experts only, but were collectively formulated, the effect of that is, and then I will stop more or less, the effect of this was that a governmental party that was around the table said, this is interesting. Designers are not formulating which commission they would like to compete for tomorrow, but they're formulating ideas that I could pick up as policymaker. And we are no longer in a commissioner-client relationship. We are actually co-constructing what the next step is. And then if I, as a governmental agency, would make available some amount of money to this table, we could set up the next step. And that's actually what is happening. Around these tables, the next steps were constructed, were really formulated on sheets of paper. This is what we should do. Who should do this? Who should enable this? And now, and then I will go a little bit quick, what is happening is through the exhibitions and the debates, is that these projects are actually happening. Many participants, very different types of participants, very different work formats, plenary sessions, working sessions, and now I have no image anymore, so that makes it easier to conclude. I will then conclude here. Many different sessions, but out of this came new explorations, defined not by governments, by people around one table. For example, an exploration into circular harbors. The harbors of Rotterdam, of Ghent, of Antwerp, sat together around one of these debate tables with designers working for the port of Rotterdam and policymakers of the Netherlands and Flanders, said we need to explore how, with new types of projects, circular city ports, like the Rotterdam Makers District in Rotterdam, which is a part of the harbor, which becomes the incubator for making industries, but it also requires a completely different design strategy. It's another type of urban port project. And it means that all the ports said, we actually know we need this, but we don't have the capacity to develop that alone. So it would be great if it would be developed in this peer-to-peer platform as an incubator of new strategies. And that's actually what happened with the support of governmental institutions. A cooperation with designers and ports has been set up to explore what the next step would be. Now, after an indexing of what 11 ports in this delta from Germany to France to Wallonia, Brussels, Flanders, the Netherlands would want and need, it's clear that we could actually say we need a next step. We know that we have 7 types of strategies, spatial strategies, which we could develop, and we need to make the next step. And so this is the idea of this peer-to-peer environment. I will go back. This peer-to-peer environment, and also the idea of, I started with the transformation workspace was the title, or the World Transformation Center. We need new types of infrastructure where we are not, as architects, urbanists, the genius designers that have the best answer to any given problem, but where we actually accommodate processes of cooperation between very different stakeholders. If they together could formulate, and if we could visualize where that question is landing and what potential solutions are, we can actually multiply the changes in many locations. We have the feeling and a hunch, and that's also what many people tell us, that these types of third spaces, socio-spatial incubators, impact hubs, all the words you could use for it, are an infrastructure that we now see as incidental and nice in our cities, but will become a structural element, a crucial infrastructure if we really want to not talk about the changes and the future we would need to want, or we would want, but if we would like to make the changes happen on the ground, we need these translation incubators which go from very ambitious goals to concrete changes in our streets, our neighborhoods, and our cities. Thank you.